So welcome everybody to today's Extension Master Gardener Continuing Education webinar. We're so excited, and I know many of you are so interested in this topic, to learn about growing your own exotic spices, both indoors and out here in North Carolina. And just a quick reminder, of course, our series is made possible through the through our Extension Endowment, our Extension Master Gardener Endowment, and those people that help support it through either donations or renewing your license plate. This helps cover some of the expenses, like having an expanded Zoom license, having students work on our transcripts so the subtitles are correct. So we appreciate everybody who supports the endowment that helps support and make possible things like our continuing education series.
Rough note.
And we're so excited to welcome Tasha Greer here today, who is going to be our speaker. And Tasha is extremely knowledgeable on this topic of growing your own spices, because that's what she does at her home in Surry County, which is up in the foothills if you're not familiar with the area. And she has about 1.5 acres where she grows a large variety of annual and perennial edible, medicinal, and ecosystem support plants. Along with all of her spices and herbs and plants, she keeps ducks and dairy goats and chickens. And she even has a pet turkey, which I hope is still with you since Thanksgiving's passed, worms, and occasionally pigs. So Tanya is a true homesteader. She blogs regularly for the Grow Network and Morning Chores, and her work has also appeared in Mother Earth News magazine. And of course, she has recently written the book, it's just been released, on Grow Your Own Spices, Harvest Homegrown Ginger, Turmeric, Saffron, Wasabi, Vanilla, Cardamom, and other incredible spices, no matter where you live. So that's what she's here to talk about today. But the other thing that's really exciting about Tasha is she is an Extension Master Gardener volunteer in Surry County. So not only does she share all of her knowledge through her writing and her sustainable living and her website, as you see, simplestead.com, but she also shares that as a Master Gardener volunteer. So we're so happy to have you as part of the Master Gardener Volunteer Program, and then for your willingness to come and join us today, Tasha, and share your knowledge. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. I will stop sharing my screen so you can start sharing yours. And you're muted right now, just so you'll know to unmute.
All right, I'm unmuted now, I believe, right?
Yes.
All right, let's get the PowerPoint up here. So can you see this presentation cover?
I think it's about to come on. It tells us that you've started sharing your screen. Sometimes it takes just a few seconds for the...
Let everything catch up here.
Yeah.
And Control H.
There we go.
Okay, so it's visible to everybody now?
Yes. Yep, we see the full screen view.
All right, wonderful. So thank you guys so much for being here today. I know it's always kind of tough to get up and going in the morning and come to a class, but it means a lot to me that you're here. I'd like to thank Charlotte for setting this up, and also Joanna Radford, who's the extension agent that I work with in Surry County, for connecting us and making this all possible. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, and so I just want to make sure that we appreciate these wonderful people putting these great programs together for us. I also want to thank all of you guys, because you're on this presentation because you're Master Gardeners here in North Carolina, or because you're Extension Office employees. And you guys are doing great work in our beautiful state all the time. And I just want to thank you very much for your contributions. I really think gardening is such an important activity, and it changes lives that we share our knowledge with others. So thank you so much for that. I also do want to point out that this isn't an advanced course. It's really geared toward Master Gardeners. So I'm going to skip a lot of the basics and assume that you know things like soil preparation and how to water plants and how to fertilize plants. I'll give you some specific details when we get into the spices, but I won't be doing sort of the introduction level kind of things that we would do in our county classes, for people that may or may not have extensive gardening experience. But that being said, if there are particular questions that you want to know, like if you're starting a spice garden, then just save those for the end and I'll be happy to go into more detail. But otherwise, during this presentation, if you have any questions on the materials that we're talking about, go ahead and put those in the chat room and we'll try to keep up and answer those questions as we go. Just to give you an idea of what we're going to be covering though, I'm going to talk a little bit about my process for writing this book, because one of the things that I never thought about as a gardener was that people might be gardening in conditions different than the ones I'm gardening in. When you're writing a book that's going to be sold in the US and Australia and France and all these different countries, you have to think about gardening a little bit differently. And that process of research really helped me hone a lot of my gardening skills. So I want to share some of those details with you because I think they'll help you figure out how to grow these plants and really form a connection with them. So then I'm also going to talk about just sort of an overview of spices that you can easily grow here in North Carolina, the ones that grow well outside, the ones that grow well if you start them inside and take them outside, and the ones that are kind of better if you just keep them indoors. So we'll be going into to just highlights on that. And then we're going to get into some meaty details about some specific spices. And those will be primarily saffron and ginger family plants. So there's a lot, ginger is just one plant, but turmeric, cardamom, galangal, there are a whole bunch of ginger plants, awapui, that you can actually grow using basically the same information. So we'll kind of cover those as a broad group and go into a little bit of detail on those. And then just as some teasers to encourage you to try some really fun plants, we're going to talk a bit about vanilla and about black pepper and about Sichuan pepper. So, so that's our lineup for today. Does anyone have any questions about that or any particular things that they want to see during that conversation? And I am looking because my chat has disappeared again. Control H.
I've not seen any specific questions. Yeah, but we've got somebody who's a fan of growing the Zingiberaceae.
Oh, yes.
His family members.
Zanzibar. Isn't that an exciting name, Zanzibar? it sounds exotic. All right, guys. So our first slide here is my secrets to learning how to grow exotic spices. So when you're doing this, first of all, I basically knew how to grow these plants, but I didn't know exactly, how much cold could they take? How much heat could they take? Did they respond better to this kind of fertilizer versus that kind of fertilizer? Are there little tips and tricks that you can use to make them grow better? Are there situations that cause stress? So I basically had to torture my plants at the beginning, putting them through heat and cold extremes, and that would include even putting plants in the refrigerator. And it was just kind of fun. I was like a mad scientist. So there was a whole lot of testing that went into figuring out what a plant can actually take, no matter, where in the world you might be growing it. So that was kind of one of the fun elements. But the other thing is that we're not trying to torture plants when we're raising them. We're actually trying to grow them in the best possible environment that we can so that they can grow really well and be super productive. So another thing that I spent a lot of time on in researching the spices was understanding their native environment. So that native environment would be like looking at where they evolved, where on the planet, what the climate conditions were like in those locations. Where did they spread to as well? Because that, where plants end up tells you a lot about what kind of conditions they find comfortable. So that was a lot of the research. And when you get into those kind of understanding the native environment, it's like you see the plant as something, as like being a person almost, because just in the same way that we have all of these qualities that relate to where we grew up and the experiences we had, so do these plants. One of the examples I really loved was cinnamon. Because cinnamon is, it's kind of a tropical to subtropical plant. It likes high humidity, but it's actually a weed in some places because birds basically eat the flower, the seeds, and they spread it around. And, it gets basically dropped as an understory, as a seed in the understory of the forest. And then it sprouts and it grows up, in shade for a long time in this sort of cool, humid, shady area, until it finally forces its way to the sun and starts out competing other plants. And so it's like when you give cinnamon its ideal conditions, it's actually a bit of a pest plant. And that was kind of, that made me look at cinnamon a different way. We think about it as this exotic spice that is hard to grow because we live in, a colder climate, temperate climate. But in its native range, it can be a really productive weed. So when I recognized it as a weed, then I was like, oh, if I want cinnamon to grow well, all I really need to do is give it weed-like conditions. So raise the humidity, give it shade while it's young, make sure that it gets, rain, but not every day. So it's, once you start thinking about it, the way that it grows best, that really changes your ability to understand how to grow it. And the other things I looked at were the history of cultivation. So the thing with a lot of spices is that most of them are still primarily grown in their native ranges. So they're not being grown everywhere all over the planet the way that, say, roses are. So we don't have a whole lot of experience, growing ginger outdoors in North Carolina because, it's mostly produced in countries that have more amenable climates. So when you look at how it's grown and produced in those other countries and how they cultivate it, what their conditions are, what their soil is like, when they're harvesting, that starts to give you a lot more insight into the growing process. Let's see, sorry, I've got a little something in my way here. But the next thing is modern cultivation practices are so different from ancient cultivation practices. Before we had tractors and things like that, people would grow things very different. And so when we're gardening at a home scale, the commercial answers, are going to be very different than the ancient practices. So it's important to kind of understand what are people doing in a farm environment, but what did people do in, a home kitchen garden kind of environment, and what are those differences? So, for example, sesame is something that is pretty rarely grown in big cultivation farms. So there's not a whole lot of people growing sesame like wheat, sorry, not like weed, but like hemp, I guess. But so sesame is a plant that is primarily still cultivated by hand, mostly in India. Although there is now a kind of sesame that the seed heads don't shatter so easily. And so it is being cultivated by machines now, but that's a fairly new innovation. So sesame is one of those plants that people are still hand cultivating. And so you can learn a lot from their practices. So understanding sort of both commercial production and home production and small scale production really helps to figure out how to grow these things in your garden. And then of course, any plant that we grow, we always want to know what kind of pests is it going to be prone to, what kind of stressors, is it able to tolerate any lack of moisture, or does it always have to be moist? So those kind of things you also have to look at. And so for that, you go to the scholarly research, because any of these crops that have been cultivated for sale, in a global spice trade, they're going to have a lot of research on them. So you can find out a lot about what, the concerns are by reading the research, because people are looking for ways to, prevent fungal pathogens, or ways to better fertilize so that so much fertilizer is not wasted. So those kind of things, that scholarly research really helps to understand a plant. And then another thing that's very important is phenology. And that's because when you take a plant out of its native conditions, where say it may get a certain number of hours of sun, at different times of the year relative to its position near the equator, it's like you got to figure out how to account for those sun hours. So, you know, a plant might grow in 3 or 4 months in its native range, and it might take longer, you know, as you get into areas that have less daylight. So you really have to understand what the plant's native daylight needs are and how it responds to those. You know, and also is it driven by soil temperatures? Because a lot of plants, garlic is a great example. You know, it sets roots best in cooler soil temperatures, and it sets bulbs best in warmer temperatures. So if you want really nice big bulbs, you have to give it both of those conditions in sequence. So phenology is something that it really helps to understand when you're taking a plant out of its native habitat and trying to adapt it to another location. And, you know, another thing you have to think about as a gardener these days is climate change risks. So, you know, I mean, it's some of these plants really are more susceptible to some of the changes like increase in rain. You know, it's this year we had so much rain that some of my paprika peppers, which are normally a no-brainer for me, I mean, I can grow them in my sleep. Some of them just got too much moisture around the root zone, and I had some losses because of that. So understanding, like, you know, what kind of pressures can it and can't it tolerate, and what you need to prepare for, that was part of my research. And some other things were the historical uses. You know, a lot of people use more of the plant than we do today. So ginger, for example, we primarily eat the underground stem, that's the rhizome portion. But historically, people have used the greens a lot. And so that was, you know, kind of surprising to me because I'd never eaten a ginger green. I'd only eaten the rhizomes. So I started chopping up some of the greens into my salad. And then modern uses, you know, a lot of these things we actually break down for their component parts because they, you know, like turmeric is something, the curcumin aspect is something that people are looking at for medicinal purposes. And so, you know, understanding those kind of new uses that we're looking at also helps. And then cultural traditions, you know, it's kind of fun. These plants didn't evolve in a vacuum. They evolved with human culture. You know, people raised them. And so learning about the cultural perspectives and why spices are valued in a particular culture was a lot of fun. And so, you know, that was really sort of the process that went into writing this book, is looking at all of those aspects, along with all that testing and my own, you know, experience at growing these spices, my successes and failures, and putting all that together in a book that, you know, that hopefully everybody can use at home, no matter where you live. So that was kind of the exciting process. And if you really want to dig deep into gardening, just start picking your favorite plants and look at them from all these different angles, and they will reveal so much to you. So that's just something I'm sharing with you guys because you're master gardeners, and I know that you're always trying to, you know, dig deeper into things and learn more rather than just, you know, basic how-to instructions. So are there any questions on that subject?
No, yeah, we have some great questions coming in about specific spices, but we'll save those and I'll share them with you when we get to talk about those.
All right, sounds great. So now I want to tell you about spices versus herbs, because one of the questions, I've been doing a lot of interviews for the books, and one of the things that always comes up is what's the difference? And so I've kind of devised, you know, sort of my breakdown. Now I'll tell you, as a cook, you know, the lines are blurred for me because I always think of spices as more intensely flavored, as things that store a lot better. Whereas I think of herbs as things that tend to be better used fresh, and, you know, that even if you can store them, you won't be able to store them quite so long because they'll start to lose some of their aromatic properties. And so that's where I kind of make the dividing line as a cook. And, you know, other people have other opinions, and there's no right answer on this, guys. We get to decide for ourselves. But when I was writing this book, I had to figure out the exact distinction. And so for me, I drew that line at plant maturity. Because, you know, growing some leafy herbs, you know, a little mint for leaves or something like that, you don't really have to understand the full plant life cycle to get the best result. You really just need to know basic growing instructions, like what kind of soil it likes, how much fertilizer, how often to water, how much sun, those kind of things. Whereas when you're growing spices, you have to know, what are the pollination requirements? What are, when is it going to produce those rhizomes, and what things have to happen to trigger that? Is it biennial? Is it going to need some, some cold time, some chill hours before it's going to be, sort of permitted by its reproductive system to produce seeds? So there's just a lot more knowledge that goes into growing a spice versus growing in herbs. There's kind of a gray area though when you talk about like bay leaves, bay laurel, and rosemary. That one, a lot of us think of that as those as herbs because you're harvesting the leaves. But if you're harvesting them to, fresh to throw in, a soup or something like that, the tender grains tend to be better because they are not so chewy and they kind of dissolve faster. But if you want to store them, then when the plant leaves mature a little bit more, when they're larger in size, when they're a little bit more on the leathery side, they're going to hold more of those aromatic oils. And so they tend to be better to store. So on something like that, I usually draw the line at storage and how long they store. But in general, the things with spices, you're harvesting flower buds, fruits, seeds, stems, rhizomes, and the roots. With herbs, you're getting the tender leafy green portions, or purple basils and shiso, things like that. So the other thing is spices take longer. One of the examples I like to use is cilantro. Because that's, cilantro, the leaves only take, you can do them as microgreens in a week and a half. You can do them as leaves in a month. You can do them as spices in 4 months. So that's kind of a good example. Also, spices have special harvesting procedures. You're not just picking the leafy greens every time. There's going to be some other process that you have to apply to make those spices durable, and then they can last longer, about a year. Herbs, even when I dry herbs, I usually tend to keep them between 6 and 8 months just till I get my next harvest, because I just find that they decline so much faster than the spices that I can store typically for 3 years. So, and spices all have culinary applications where we have lots of herbs that we grow, for fragrance alone or for medicinal purposes. So now spices also have medicinal purposes, but the ones I'm talking about are their primary purpose is culinary. So are there any questions on that distinction? I do have a couple examples to go through.
Nothing specific, just an interesting comment though about sweet neem, which is a plant I haven't heard of, that Garish, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, says his wife has been growing sweet neem and using it as curry leaf. Yeah, he's got the scientific name there, Murea coiniga. I'm guessing on how to pronounce it.
That's wonderful.
So, new plant.
I'm Charlotte. For some reason, even though we tried this earlier, my comment section, my chat's not coming up. So I'm trying.
It's called a curry leaf in many places.
Okay.
And you can buy that in Indian stores as curry leaves. They're composite leaves.
But so this is I have 2 different kinds of curry leaf trees growing in my greenhouse. I think one of them, I wish I had the scientific names ready, but I'm terrible at that. I always have to write them down. But I have not heard them called sweet neem. So is that a completely different plant?
No, it's the same, but in India we call it sweet neem.
Okay.
So,
well, thank you so much. You taught me something. I'm writing that down so I can look it up after we get through that. But yes, I love those leaves. Most of my curries are so much improved by just adding those leaves, and I had no idea until I started growing them and harvesting them at home. So, and that's another example. Those the curry that he's talking about, those leaves, when the plant is very young, the leaves are the leaves are very young. They're very tender. You can just chop them up. They're kind of they're even more tender than basil, but their flavor actually intensifies a bit as they get older. So again, that's one of those plants that, depending on when you harvest it, you might call it an herb, and other times you might call it a spice. But a few more examples, like a lot of you guys are probably growing spices and just haven't thought about it from that mature, immature plant distinction. But dill leaf is the herb, whereas dill seed is the spice. Cilantro is the herb. Coriander seed is the spice. And coriander seed, by the way, is actually a fruit that contains 2 seeds. So we call it seed for, it's this sort of seed size, but that's why if you plant coriander seed, sometimes you'll get 2 plants in the same place, or, if you plant 3, you might get 5 or 6. So that was kind of, it was fun to dissect the seeds and test the viability of the individual seeds. And most of the time, both of them germinated. So that explained a lot why I thin coriander a lot. But ginger rhizomes are a spice, and the leaf shoots are an edible herb. Horseradish, I don't know if everyone knows this, but horseradish leaves are actually really delicious when they're young, not when they get older, and the harlequin bugs really like to eat them. When they start getting that pungent, they're not so wonderful. But if you get them young, like in the beginning of spring, they're delicious. But when you let the roots mature and get large and, go through a frost or 2, and they're super sweet and spicy at the same time, that's going to be a spice, because you can preserve that in vinegar and hang on to it for a year. Allspice is definitely a plant you have to grow indoors and maybe take out in warm weather, but even just as an herb or a tea, it's wonderful. So even if you never can grow it to the size to get the allspice fruits, it's still a wonderful plant to have. And then we talked about the gray area of rosemary and basil. So now, it's, like I said, you're all welcome to your own thoughts on what, a spice versus an herb is. But I just think from a garden planning perspective, getting ready to harvest and thinking how much space you're going to be giving it and how long it's going to be in your garden, it's nice to have this, this distinction between mature and immature plants. So with that kind of cleared up, I do want to give you a list here of some of the outdoor spices for North Carolina. And I'm going to go through them and just maybe mention a few things. So angelica is an herb that most people, it's a spice, we grow it for the seeds usually, but most people really think of it as more of a medicinal kind of product rather than a flavoring product. But historically, that is definitely something that was used to flavor food, much like anise. So you don't want to eat large amounts of it because there could be some instances of toxicity. But just give it a taste and see what you think, because it's kind of surprising. Anise also. Caraway. Caraway is actually quite easy to grow here, but it does require either very early planting, because I was here for 3 seasons before I realized caraway was supposedly a biennial, because I was getting enough chill hours by starting it early and planting it out early. And then I live, sort of in a mountain area. And so we got enough chill hours that they actually flowered in 1 year for me. So when I started trying planting them at different times, that's when I realized, oh, wait a minute. Okay, so this needs vernalization. And without that, you're not going to get the flower production. So depending on when and how you plant it, you may get, your flowers and your seeds in 1 year, or you may have to wait till the next year. So coriander we've talked about, but that's where I am. We're zone 7A here in Surry County, North Carolina. And I actually scatter my coriander at the end of, end of the sort of growing season, when I take things out of the bed, and it comes up whenever it wants. I'll have a few plants die off over the winter, but most of them will survive all the way through winter. And they'll produce flowers pretty early, usually in March, and then I'll actually be able to harvest starting as early as April and the beginning of May. So that's one of the sort of tricks I've learned to grow coriander. When you have a little bit of not too many super hard frosts, it's a lot more cold hardy than people give it credit for. So dill and fennel, those guys, I just want to highlight that they definitely cross-pollinate. And depending on when you plant your fennel and your dill, you could be facing issues with that. So whenever you plant those guys, fennel can be an annual, a biennial, or a perennial. So know what you're planting and when you're expecting it to flower. but try to time those separately. Otherwise, when you harvest those seeds, they're not going to be so delicious. Fennel tastes the worst when it's been pollinated by dill, but dill doesn't taste very good when it's been pollinated by fennel either. And fenugreek is a wonderful, wonderful legume that a lot of people historically used to use to feed animals because it's a cool season legume like peas. And, you know, in sort of ideal conditions, the plants can get pretty big and it's very, very aromatic. So it draws animals to it. So they used it for hay you know, I think it actually probably made the hay smell good. So people might have liked it for that reason. But fenugreek is pretty easy to grow. It's kind of compact. You can shell it just like a pea, even though it's very tiny, or you can fully dry it and you can thresh and winnow kind of processing for it. But the plant smells wonderful from beginning to end. The seeds are so aromatic. It is a nitrogen fixer. So if you leave those roots in the ground after I just harvest the whole plant, kind of clip it with scissors. And then I just take the plant and dry the plant because even the leaves are aromatic. And so you can use those for a little bit of cooking as well. And then leave the roots in the ground because they'll have those nitrogen nodes on there and it's a nitrogen fixer for you. So juniper is a plant I grew a long time ago, but I have allergies. So I try to keep juniper out of my garden just because it produces, you need a male juniper to get the, fruits, the pine cones actually or the cones on a juniper plant. But that one I don't grow, but it is quite easy to grow here. So lavender, obviously there's lots and lots of varieties of lavender that you can grow, but I do recommend isolating the ones that are specific for food purposes, culinary purposes, because the ones that they use for oil sometimes have a bitter aftertaste. So when you're reading your descriptions from your seed providers or getting your plants, try to look for the ones that say that they're best for culinary applications. Mustard is kind of like coriander. I just throw those seeds out end of season. They sprout over winter. They're absolutely stunning in March, April, and May. The seed pods are prolific, and they're a great sort of pollinator food source during our colder times when we don't have as many flowering plants out there. So that one's another great one. It's really easy to dry those and harvest the seeds, and then you can use them for condiments, for mustard. You can also I use the brown mustard that I grow for leaves so that I don't have to worry about, keeping different varieties. And those brown mustard seeds actually pop in the pan just like black mustard seeds do. So you can even use them for different cooking and particularly for making curries and things. So let's see, Nigella is sometimes they call it black seed. It's not something we use a whole lot in the US, but they use it a lot in Poland, like for breads. It's kind of a poppy seed substitute for them. But they're really beautiful little plants. They're a close relative of love in the mist, which is a kind of a cottage flower that's very beautiful. And they grow quite well here. Just start them in the cooler temperatures and give them a chance to establish, and they'll do great. But they're very beautiful. And the seeds, they're not super aromatic, but they do add a kind of nice supporting spice flavor. So they go really well in a lot of spice blends. So peppers, like I said, normally those are a no-brainer, but we've had so much rain lately. Next year, I'm going to put some of them in containers just to make sure that they have really good drainage, because if you have a lot of organic matter and are a big compost user like I am, then you always, of course, run a little bit of risk of holding too much water when you get 4 to 7 inches in a 2-day period and have that happen every day for 2 weeks. So, but cayenne, gochu is a variety of pepper that is used in Korean kimchi. And it is a very distinct tasting pepper. It can be anywhere from almost sweet to spicy, depending on where you get your seeds. But it's really just a wonderful tasting pepper if you like a little bit of heat but not too much heat. And you can use it for a lot more than making kimchi. It's also just sort of a good general spice, even in place of cayenne for people that don't like it too hot. And paprika, you can do, hot paprika, or you can do mild paprika, and they both grow really well here. There are lots of different kinds of paprika. So you can get the long peppers that are like the Hungarian paprikas, but you can also get ones that look a little bit like bell peppers, except for they're kind of small and cute, and they start out buttery and white. So, there are lots of good varieties of paprika that you can find from different seed suppliers. So, sorry, my nose. And then poppy seeds. So poppy seeds grow really well here, but I will warn you that they're a weed. They definitely self-sow. It's really hard to harvest at the right time. So if you're going to grow them, I would recommend that you pick some ornamental varieties and, not go for heavy seed production, or you'll be dealing with lots of poppy seed plants forever. The ornamental ones don't produce quite as much as many seeds, and they don't germinate quite as well. So it's a little bit of a weed saver. And let's see, safflower is another one that we can grow here. And it's kind of these pretty little flowers, daisy looking flowers. Some people call this a spice because the flowers can color things just the way that saffron does, but I don't think it tastes like a spice. So that one I put a maybe on. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. Sesame, they're growing it at Monticello. So we can definitely grow it here in North Carolina. You just, if you are in like where I'm at, I don't plant the seeds until the end of April. I do usually have to harvest some of the pods green because it'll start to get too cold here. So then I'll dry them, hang them dry. I won't leave them out to dry too long. But you can definitely get it in our growing seasons here. When you're in the warmer areas along the coast, you'll even have better results. So Sichuan pepper, we're going to go into that in more detail at the end, but that's a shrub that produces a seed pod that is a Chinese spice. And we're not so familiar here with it in the US, but it's something that grows really well here. And you guys might already know this, but the staghorn sumac that is sometimes a bit of a weed around here has harvestable, it's the pericarps around the fruits that are really the spice. But it's a good alternative to the sumac that is commercially produced. It's not quite the same flavor profile, but it is a good option. And then on the root side, root stems and rhizomes, chicory. If you like chicory coffee, the French style chicory coffee, chicory grows great here. And you just want to start that very early though, because we do get our hot summers, and as long as it's well established and you keep on watering it, you'll still get giant roots. And it's also something, it's typically a biennial, so you don't normally have to worry about seeds, but you'll definitely want to harvest it before it flowers. Otherwise, you'll end up with lots more chicory. It's a wonderful self-sowing. You can eat it as an herb too, the leaves, so it could be an herb or a spice. Horseradish, that one is an all-time favorite of mine. I don't really grow the traditional way where you try to get these 1 foot, long, 2 foot horseradish roots. Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
I think that was an accident. Somebody was accidentally unmuted.
Let's go back here. Sorry, my presentation just jumped one. Guys, give me 1 second. I think my computer froze. Short delay here. There we go. Now I'm back on the right slide. But horseradish is, you don't really have to get those big stems to get a good harvest. I mean, the big roots to get a good harvest. You can actually take those small ones, just go out with a bucket of water and pick out all the small little side roots and things and put them straight into the water, and then take that into the house, wash them really well, don't peel them, put them in your food processor with some vinegar, and you can preserve it that way. So don't feel like if you have clay soil, it's really hard to get those really big roots, but you can harvest and use all those small ones as well. Horseradish, of course, has a tendency to be invasive. It's an excellent root to like just breaks through clay. It's a great clay breaker. So if you don't want to be dealing with extra horseradish plants, then definitely put it in a container. Licorice is a little bit tricky, particularly in the colder parts of North Carolina. So you might want to give it some winter protection, you know, put a cloche over it, or put a row cover or something like that, but we can definitely grow it here. Saffron we'll get into more detail on. Sassafras is another sort of great bark like cinnamon that and root. It's actually mostly the root for sassafras, but that you can grow here fairly easily, and you might even have it already growing around you. So that is used to flavor sodas. So I consider it a spice since it's definitely a culinary aromatic flavoring component. And garlic, garlic grows really well here. And garlic, if you know, in places like Wilmington, you probably need a lot of soil amendment if you're, you know, in sandier soils or something. And you might want to just put your bulbs in the fridge for a couple weeks before you plant them, just to make sure that that they feel the cool weather coming and start to want to put down roots and grow really quickly. So, are there any questions on the outdoor spices that we've kind of run through?
There are several questions coming in, and I think some of them will get to those specific spices, but there was someone asking about the juniper berries, if all of the juniper species have edible berries.
That's a great question, and the answer is no. Some of them are poisonous, and if you give me 1 second here, I'll actually, you know what, I'm going to come back to that, because I've got to look up the names. Like I said, I'm terrible at the Latin names, but just the common juniper is your best choice for safest juniper berries. But there definitely are a few that are poisonous. So I'll pull that information at the end and give you a list. So, and Charlotte, I'm sorry, I'm clicking chat multiple times, and I'm wondering if it's hidden someplace or. So I've done the Alt-8.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not coming up. I've been keeping, I'm keeping track and keeping a list of the questions, but there've been a couple of requests for seed sources. Do you have any recommended seed sources? And I didn't know if that's something you have posted on your website, or if that's something you could share and we can send as a follow-up email, or if there's a couple of places you'd like to mention.
That's a wonderful question. And I actually have a slide at the end, so we will get to that. And I should have mentioned in the beginning. It is hard to find spices for sure. But there are, you know, there's a lot more interest in it developing. Obviously, there's so many of you on today, and you know, I wrote a book about it. So it's like we're all interested in this. So the plant and seed suppliers are definitely starting to catch up. But I have a resource list a little bit later on. So those are great questions. So Charlotte, since I'm having a technical problem, just fill me in if I need anything. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So, all right, so plants that you really kind of have to keep indoor for a good portion of the year, and that you can take outdoors when the weather is warm, are things like allspice for the fruits, annatto. Annatto is also called accio, and it's a very beautiful plant. Some people call it the lipstick plant. It gets these big red burrs that are kind of prickly, but when they crack open, they have these little seeds inside that have this coating around it. And the coating is really what kind of contributes color and flavor to food. It's not a very strong flavor, but it's kind of a nice thickening agent, and it gives just a little bit of spicy tang. But those plants are actually quite lovely. They have these lobed leaves that kind of fold just a little bit in the middle. So they always look like hearts hanging on the trees. And so you do have to grow them indoors most of the year until you get, you know, into putting your tomatoes out kind of time frame. But they do grow well in containers. You just have to watch out because they have a taproot. So they will start to overextend if you're not keeping the nutrients toward the surface of your pot. So for those, I really kind of do, I sometimes do the compost tea as my fertilizer, but I've kind of started using a slow release fertilizer just at the top, that way when you water down, it kind of stays in the top nutrient zone and delays the taproot. growth a little bit. So a tall, narrow container for that. And I forgot to mention, allspice is kind of, it's an interesting plant to grow just as an herb, but to get fruit production is kind of complicated because these plants aren't commercially produced very much. I know Fast Growing Trees has some, and that was pretty much the only location where I could find good specimens. But the way that they grow them in Jamaica, where they're mostly grown, they literally plant them, and then 7 years later, they discover whether or not the plants are male or female, or whether or not they're going to produce fruits. And there's just not a whole lot known about, about the cycle of producing fruits, because some plants, even without a male pollinator, somehow, these plants will produce some seeds and fruits, and sometimes they won't. So they always suggest that you plant at least 3 of these, and they're big. They get quite big. You can keep them to about 8 feet, but any smaller than that, you're not really going to get production. So they suggest you get 3 of them to start. That way you have a better odds of actually getting some fruit. So if you grow allspice, I highly recommend that you really do it just for the delicious smelling leaves that you can use in teas, and you can use kind of like a bay leaf. You could even put them in, like if you make cordials, if you put the leaves in alcohol and draw out all that allspice flavor, they work really well for that. So don't expect allspice fruit if you just have one allspice tree. So that's just a warning on that. Caper is another one. Caper is in Tuscany, they have it growing out of walls. It just kind of, the seeds make their ways into a little crack and, some sandy soil, and they barely get watered, and somehow they germinate, and then they start seeping around through cracks, and they're just really these awesome survival plants. But when you try to grow them in cultivation, most of us baby them too much. And so they end up being overwatered. They end up not having enough room. We try to keep them in small pots when these are plants that love to spread their roots and search around for nutrients, and that kind of prefer to be on the drier side. So the thing with capers is you kind of have to abuse them a little bit to get a good result. The other thing though is caper leaves taste delicious. They're a lot, I had no expectation of them being delicious because they look a little leathery, but they're very tasty, and insects, particularly like the roly-polies, love them. So you do have to think about protection for capers here, just because we do live in a moister climate with lots of insects that like moist soil. So cumin is another easy one to grow, but I definitely recommend that you start it indoors, and then you can transplant it outside very carefully. I would leave the soil intact. I wouldn't try like a pricking out method with cumin, because once you disturb the taproot, it's going to be stunted. Even if you just start in a seed planting medium and then transfer it to another pot. So disposable, like the jiffy pots or whatever, the cardboard pots, those kind of things tend to work really well for the cumin. But start it indoors early, because it really likes a long, cool growing season. And most of us, in North Carolina, start to get a little bit too warm. And cumin doesn't have the best production if it starts prematurely flowering. So if it bolts, rather than just following its natural cycle, you're not going to get as much from the plant. So if you can start early, that's important. So celery grows some of the areas that are warmer. You can actually keep it outside with just some protection. But where I live in 7A, we're kind of on the cusp, and so I actually bring my celery in. I grow it in pots if I want it to flower, or I grow it in the greenhouse even. And so, yeah, if I leave it out in my soil, most likely the plant's going to die, even with protection. So that's not something I grow year round outside. I do that in the greenhouse, or I do that in a pot. But it does require some cold to produce the flowers and the seeds. So you do need to have it cold enough. I've got it like planted in my greenhouse up toward the window as far as I can get it away from my heat source. So that way it's feeling the cold from outside in its root zone. And so it does in fact flower in my greenhouse every year. But, and the other thing is that you can keep it as a perennial, so it can just keep on growing. So you don't have to replant every year if you're doing it for seeds. And tamarind is another fun one. It's a huge tree. When you plant it outside, it can get like 100 feet, but you can keep it small in a container. You can actually bonsai it. So, you know, you want to nip the main anchor roots a little bit and kind of keep the side roots trimmed and keep it a little bit nutrient and moisture deprived. That way it doesn't do too much growing. It takes a long time, but it will also pod even when you keep it as a bonsai. So, so even though it's really a big plant that needs a lot of room, you can keep it small. So it's just fun. It's kind of pretty. The leaves open and close with the daylight. So, you know, they're open during the day and closed at night, or if it gets too sunny, the leaves will close. So it's nice to see that change. All right, and then mature leaves. These are the kaffir lime and the bay laurel. Bay laurel, zone 8 people, you guys can probably keep that outside. I would put it in a not so windy location because it's a little bit less cold hardy than I expected it to be. But you know, when you start getting into the 7 side of things, I would really avoid keeping that outside and try to put it, you know, keep it in your house in a pot and just take it out in the summer, or keep it in your greenhouse or a conservatory type environment. But it really is a beautiful plant. It smells great. It's super easy to grow. It's very hard to start though, because, you know, if you want to do cuttings, it can take up to 18 months. And even then you won't have very good returns. So you need to start a lot of it. So it's slow growing at first and then picks up. But it's a really nice house plant. So you can do it indoor, outdoor also, though it does like to go outside. Just don't keep it out when it's going to be super rainy, because it's a plant that likes mostly dry roots. And then we've talked, we're going to talk more about ginger, turmeric, but lemongrass that we also harvest for the plump stems when the plant's almost fully mature. That grows really well in pots or in a greenhouse, and you can, you know, take it in and out as long as, you know, just think of it like tomatoes. If tomatoes can go out, your lemongrass can go out, and it does like full sun, and it will grow better in hot conditions. Wasabi is kind of a specialty thing that it needs pretty much full shade. I was skeptical about that, so I tried it in multiple different sun levels, and it absolutely is a full shade plant. You can definitely grow it indoors, but you have to water it so much that you need to set up a good situation for watering it. So in winter, it goes a little bit more dormant, you know, because of the loss of light and things like that. It's not exactly dormant, but it grows a lot more slowly. And so it doesn't need quite so much watering in winter. So you could put it in a pot, take it outside in summer and keep it well watered in a cool, shady location, and then bring it indoors in winter. And it is cold hardy down to about 40 degrees. I wouldn't push it much further than that. But it takes about 2 years, maybe 3 in a container to get a good harvest. So it's, if you love wasabi, it's totally worth doing, but I actually like horseradish more. So this is one that I grow for fun, but I don't really grow it as a staple crop. And then the last one is the bark of the cinnamon. So when people grow the cinnamon, like in Sri Lanka, they actually coppice it and make a very big shrub, so that way they can be continuously harvesting, you know, entire trunks and carving the bark off. That you can do if you have a big greenhouse, a lot of space. You can definitely do that here in North Carolina. You do need to keep your greenhouse above 55 degrees, or if you have like a big conservatory space, this plant will definitely be stressed at lower temperatures. But you can also just harvest the sort of new stems and things like that, and they are not as strong or aromatic and not as long storing, but they are definitely cinnamon scented, and you can use them, you know, chop them up and put them in foods. Just peel them with like your carrot peeler, and use them in teas, or, you know, for aromatics. So you can also just use those little whips. Are there any questions on those spices?
We do have a question about the picture. Which plant is in the picture?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. That's actually the caper leaves. So you can see that's a young caper leaf. It looks very leathery, but it's super delicious. And you can see where it's been munched on by, those are the pill bugs, the roly-polies that are munching on the ends there. They love it. They'll actually climb up you know, they tend to do a lot of surface eating, but this plant is so delicious to them that they will climb up the stems and they'll climb out to the tips of the leaves and eat it from the tips. It's kind of bizarre.
And we also have a couple of questions and comments about our native spice bush, Lindera benzoin, as a potential substitute for the true allspice. And I didn't know if you've ever tried that or have used that one.
No, I really need to. I have a friend who's a native plant seller, and I think he's got that in his inventory, but he always sells out before I get one. So, but that's a great suggestion, because there are, there are plants that we kind of discount here in favor of more exotic things. I think that my focus in this book was to bring exotics into people's homes and make them accessible. So, but maybe the next book will be about native spices for North Carolina. I will check that out. Thank you to whoever shared that. I really appreciate the information.
Then we have some questions we'll hold till the end about processing different herbs and again, sources. But yeah, so I encourage people to keep adding your questions and we'll be getting back around to them.
All right, awesome, thank you. So now the spices that you really kind of want to keep indoors, and it's not that you can't take them outside, it's just that it might be, you might not get the best results taking them outside. So these are plants that really enjoy a permanent home. Rather than the indoor-outdoor kind of environments. So cardamom is actually exceptionally easy to grow. It's a lot easier than ginger and even turmeric that we're going to get into. The only problem with cardamom is it's huge. This plant at minimum is going to be about 8 feet tall and about 3 feet wide. So I grow it in a greenhouse and it smells incredible. You kind of just have to move the stems a little bit and inhale, and it's really heavenly. But it's a big plant, and it doesn't have a very deep root base, so it really kind of, like a big shallow container, which is tricky to move. And so that's the reason that it's really best to just go ahead and give it a long-term location, and make sure that it's happy in that location, because trying to move this thing when it becomes mature enough to actually produce seed pods is difficult. It also likes a lot of humidity, especially when it's flowering. Otherwise, the pollen can be sterile. So you want to give it a lot of humidity during flowering. So having control over that rather than putting it outside where it might be windy and dry one day and humid the next is a lot better for production. So that's a plant you want to give a lot of space, big wide container, and also keep in a permanent location where you can control the humidity. Black cardamom is a completely different thing. I should have put the scientific name there, but it's a sort of musky kind of smelling, not so aromatic spice, but they use it a lot in like Ethiopian cuisine or in Nepalese cuisine. So that's another plant that, like cardamom, it gets fairly big. It really kind of does best in a dedicated location where you can control the conditions. And long pepper too is another spice that is not so commonly used here in the US, but is becoming a little bit more popular now with all the chefs that are really getting into the spice cooking. And so it's grown just like cardamom and black cardamom. So there's just, if you're going to do it, give them a lot of space and dedicate an area where you can control the conditions. Now peppercorns and vanilla, we're going to get pretty deep into those toward the end, but they're both great houseplants because they're understory plants. They literally are accustomed to growing underneath large trees. So they like bright light, but they don't need full sun. So house conditions are wonderful for them. And they do need to be trellised though, and they need to be trained upward for good production. And so moving a trellised plant when it starts to get mature is pretty difficult. So that's why it's better to just, plan them a permanent location. And the rhizomes like galangal and awapui, which is shampoo ginger, but it's also an edible spice. We don't always use it that way, but historically it has been used as a spice. Those guys, because they're perennials, they're going to get bigger over time and they're going to be harder to move. And perennials really like a permanent home. So even if you're keeping them in a container, they like to know what the conditions are going to be like year round rather than being, moved a whole lot. So, so it's just nice to give these guys a permanent home. That way they know what their conditions are year round, and they'll actually kind of adjust a little bit. Galangal, in the greenhouse, it was a little bit confused the first year. And then this, now second and third year, it's starting to realize, okay, this is when I need to go dormant. And so it's a lot happier now that it's been in the same location for 3 years. So that's just like, you can take them indoors and outdoors, but I highly recommend keeping them as a primarily indoor spice. Any questions on those?
We do have a few. We had the picture of the plant in the picture, which plant was in the picture.
Back to that. So I've actually got, whoops. There, no. Oh. One more, there it is. So that's actually a galangal leaf, and the way they unfurl, they really look like vase flowers. They're very beautiful. They're light colored when they emerge, and then they grow darker green as they open up. And the galangal, the stems get really tall. So like the cardamom looks pretty similar. It's a little bit more robust of a leaf structure when it opens. But they kind of grow up short until the plant starts to get taller, and they kind of grow up like a building, like one floor after another. But the galangal, they open up and then they grow tall. So I love to watch the leaves open. They look like beautiful flowers. So even before, like with cardamom, even before it flowers, it's just stunning to see this unfolding, this unfurling of leaves.
Yes, and we have a question about how to get black pepper to bloom. We have somebody who's grown it outdoors in Wilmington. It grew really well, but it wouldn't bloom.
So yeah, that's a good question. We will go into more detail, but the quick answer is that it really requires a stable location, the ideal conditions year round. So if you're growing it entirely outdoors, and it's not its native climate, you're not really going to be able to stabilize those conditions to get it to feel comfortable to flower. So that's why with black pepper, I highly recommend an indoor location where you can control the conditions, so that the plant's like, okay, I'm at home, but now I'm going to reproduce. It's like people, they want to have a safe home before they start making new peppers.
Yeah. And we just had a comment that both galangal and, I think I'm going to say this right, awapui, are perennial in Wilmington, so down there on the coast in Zone 8. But we did have a question about how to get long pepper to germinate. Any tips on germinating long pepper? So
germinating long pepper is and cardamom, really, they're both insect pollinated. So you definitely want to be thinking about giving them some access to, in the greenhouse, I always open up my greenhouse doors in the flowering periods and let insects come in. So that's how I do it, but you can also hand pollinate. So they do take a little bit more work on that front, but yeah. There's no easy answer. You're going to need to hand pollinate if you can't create a situation where insects are invited to come visit, because they're insect pollinated generally.
Okay. Awapui is the correct pronunciation.
Yes.
It's a he on the end. It's Hawaiian. In Hawaiian, each letter is pronounced.
Yes. Thank you for that clarification, Polly. I actually lived in Maui for a year, and so I had it right at one point, but now I revert back to my lazy non-Hawaiian pronunciations. I need to get back to that.
Yeah, I lived there for 8 years.
Isn't it? It's beautiful, isn't it?
Seventh heaven.
I love the mountains here, though, so I've appreciated both climates, but that also gave me an appreciation for awapui that I did not have before I lived on Maui. Yeah. So thank you so much for getting that right for us.
You're welcome.
All right. Yeah. And we also still have some questions about sources, but as you mentioned, you'll have a slide at the end that talks about sources.
Yeah. All right, guys.
All right,
so
good.
we're at 11. We're doing pretty good. This slide is mostly just a reminder that, basic gardening principles apply. Obviously, before you start growing a plant, you need to make sure your lighting conditions, your sun and your humidity, and make sure you're protecting them before you start. You do, of course, you can't stick most of these plants except for maybe cinnamon, and it's sort of a 4.5 pH. You really do need to get to the sort of standard gardening level of, somewhere between 5.5 and 6.5, pushing 7. Obviously watering, weed, fertilizing, mulching, all these same basic gardening principles you always use apply, and plan for pollination. So we were getting that question about the black pepper and cardamom. Yes, you do have to pollinate these things by hand if you can't give them lots of access to bees and things like that. So that's something you have to worry about when you're growing it entirely indoors without insect access. So, and then harvesting, we'll get into a couple details on the next slides about the plants, specific plants we'll be going into detail about. But the goal is always to get as close to peak as possible, because that's going to mean the best possible aromatics and flavor. Like lavender is a perfect example. The flowers, literally right before a flower bursts open is when it's at its absolute peak aromatically. And that's, nature is super smart, because when those flowers open, that pollen is going to, be aging very quickly with exposure to the elements. So it puts that peak aroma there right at the very beginning, and that way all the insects rush to it as soon as the flower opens, and it's like this big, wow, I'm coming, I smell you. And so when you're harvesting it to preserve, if you can get it right before the flower is about to open, then you're going to have the most intense aromatic experience, and flavorfulness to use it as a spice. So, that you're never going to get it that perfect every time, but that's always the goal. So, and all spices will have some sort of drying, curing, senescence. We'll get into senescence shortly, powdering or preserving for later use process. So let's start talking about a few specifics now. Oops, missed that first slide there. All right, well, I'm having a problem going back to the slide I accidentally skipped over, but it basically was just North Carolina, there it is, backyard saffron. So I've got some pictures there of the various states. Generally, now I will tell you, saffron's a kind of fascinating plant in that it doesn't always follow a specific pattern as to how it emerges. Sometimes the greens will start to get a little bit big and then the flower will follow. Mostly the flower comes out first and opens before the greens start growing. So I've noticed a lot of behavior variances, and it's probably temperature and soil temperature related, but I don't know exactly what's causing it. But in that first picture, you see the flower first emerged, and it's got the 3 stigmas. That's what you harvest as the spice. The next one, the flower is gone, and you've just got the greens, because the flower will last for a few days, and then the greens are what's left behind. And then next to that, you've got fresh picked saffron, and in the jar next to it is the dried saffron. So it dries a kind of deep purple and starts out as this kind of orangey red. But saffron it's a crocus. It's really pretty much similar to any other crocus that you grow. You do have to summer plant it. Ideally, around where I'm at, it's been about August. You might want to wait a little longer in places like Wilmington, just to get your soil temperatures down just a bit. But you try to get 1-inch corms, because if you don't have 1-inch corms, then it might not produce the saffron flowers the first year. They might need to spend more time on the ground to mature before they produce the following year. But you're going to plant them 4 to 6 inches deep. Now, if you're in heavy clay, I would say 4 inches, amended with a lot of compost. But if you're in, if you've already got good, well-prepared soil, then I would actually say 6 inches, because these corms do kind of push up in the soil a little bit. And so, you know, if you can get them a little bit deeper, then that'll be better. That pointy end goes up, and you also need good drainage. So if you've only got 6 inches of soil, you're going to have a drainage problem. So you need a deeper soil depth than that. So the flowering is actually daylight and soil temperature dependent. I've tried to put them on my desk, keep them like in a pot in my desktop year round. I get grains, but never flowers. So, so the flowering is really, you're going to have to do this outside to get the right result. You might, you know, get lucky once in a while, but it's not really an ideal way to grow saffron. But the harvest has really been very different for me. So in 2018, I was getting all of my saffron to harvest in early October. 2019, it was mid-October. This year, it was mid-October all the way through to mid-November. The flowers were really irregular. So there's definitely a lot of dependence on soil temperature for that flower production. So just be aware of that. The corms, they generally produce 3 to 6 flowers each, and you get 3 stigmas per flower. So that doesn't. We have a question, or is that maybe a new participant? Okay. All right. So the flowers, you don't get a whole lot of spice, but when you're cooking with saffron, you know, you usually use somewhere, you know, 10 to 20 of these little saffron threads, the dried stigmas. And so you don't need a whole lot unless you're using paella every day. So it's definitely fun and worth growing even for those small quantities. So, and what you do need to do after they flower, which is sort of the exciting part, you still need to let those greens keep on growing all the way through winter and all the way into fall until they die naturally, because that's when they renew and create new corms for the next year. So if you were to dig them up and try to store them after they flowered, they're not going to hold very well. They won't have the nutrients to produce the next year. So you really need to wait and dig up your corms the following year. For me, it's been around May. It's been about the time when the greens are all dying back. Let's see, do I have? Okay, yes. And they are cold hardy, but they can get stressed. So whenever it starts going, we don't have too many days below 10 degrees Fahrenheit here, but there was a couple of years ago where I was a little bit concerned. So I would recommend, if we have something weird on the record, you know, the weather report saying that it's going to be, you know, extended cold below 10 degrees for, you know, days or weeks on end, then you might want to cover these with a layer of mulch or something just to make sure that they're well protected. But otherwise, they seem to do well pretty much all over the state from what I can tell. I did have a friend test them out in Wilmington, and that worked out well also, even though they're a little bit warmer, because they do like the cold as well. And I will tell you the flowering, we're going to cover the harvest, so I'll tell you that in a minute. Now, the other thing I do, because I actually have a dedicated saffron bed, is that I use that bed to grow lettuce or basil or things that aren't going to be that I can harvest and remove before the flowering period for the saffron. So you can use the same bed, just make sure that whatever you plant in the same bed with your saffron, if you want to keep it in the ground, make sure that whatever you plant is going to be out of the ground before your saffron is going to be going into its flowering period. So our next slide is harvesting saffron, but do you guys have any questions on growing saffron before I go there?
We did have a question earlier from Bonnie, who had good luck growing saffron in Craven County, New Bern, kind of towards the coast, but less success now. She's in Haywood County, which is kind of Hendersonville area. So probably colder and maybe wetter.
Yeah, it could be. Well, and yeah, this year was a little bit tricky for sure, just because of all the extra moisture I think a lot of us were facing. And like I said, that flowering period was really weird. So it could be, I don't know if you're checking them every day, but it could just be that if you're not out there every day, because they're not flowering all at once like they have in years past, you might not be seeing as much action. But yeah, and if your corms have been in the ground for more than 3 years, I would dig them up and separate them, because even if you're adding lots of compost and using some kind of fertilizer, they still just get tired of being in a big group. They like to be divided and get some space. So does that answer the question, or do you, I guess at the end, if you want, we can go into some more possible specific remedies for that.
Yes. And Louise mentions that she has a number of corms, but they all died back. And could that be just from the wet year? We had an incredibly wet year.
Yeah, this year, Arun, I think our problem was, first of all, we had the cicadas. So here they come up through the soil, they leave all these holes in the ground. Then we had all this rain. So all that rain filtered through the cicada holes and we got deeper moisture than we normally do. Then we had, you know, like at least in our county for sure, the moles and voles were going nuts. Moles in particular were tearing up everybody's yard. People were having problems walking. So all that aeration and then followed with all this moisture, a lot of people have lost bulbs and things in the ground. So it's probably not that you're doing something specifically wrong, and maybe that we just have had a rough year. And the year, not last year, but the year before, at least in our area, was a kind of similar situation minus the cicadas, where there was just a whole lot more water in the soil for most of the growing season. So, but if you guys have particular questions, we can cover those more at the end.
Yeah, I think you're about to cover this next question was
Yes.
How long will it keep once it's harvested?
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about harvesting. So for peak harvest, I actually go out and harvest twice a day. So in the morning, most of the flowers open in the morning, but again, saffron's kind of a funny little flower in that it doesn't always open in the morning. I've had plenty open in the afternoon. But getting them when they first open is best, because otherwise moisture and wind and things like that will remove some of the aromatic properties on the stigmas. So you can either remove the entire plant flower and then pick out the stigmas, or I usually just go out there and pick out just the stigmas, because I like to leave the purple flowers in the ground, because they'll live for another 2 or 3 days after I pick out the stigmas and give that purple color to my garden. And you can see there what the flower looks like, and you can see the stigmas that you pull out right next to it as an example, so you know what to harvest. So the 3 red parts, that's what you're harvesting. Usually just lie them flat on a piece of paper or something for 1 to 2 days. That'll dry them out. Don't put them in direct light, because light and heat and things like that will rob them of some of their aromatics. But the thing with saffron is it won't smell very strong at first, but if you put it in a very small glass jar and store it for a month, and then you open that jar, it'll about knock you over. So you really need to give it some time in a jar to cure. And then as far as storage, because I harvest every year, I usually, consider it 1 year, but if you have it in a small enough container, it can definitely last for 3 years. But the larger, if you have a little bit of saffron in like a, pint mason jar or something like that, a lot of those aromatics will just get lost to the air in the container. So if you want to keep it for 3 years, then give it one of those teeny tiny little, specialized containers that they sell the saffron in the store for, so that there's a lot less air volume in the container. And then, the uses for this are paella, for rice, for aromatic teas, even just a little saffron in water is quite delicious. People even use it in desserts and also as a food coloring. So we are kind of getting a little bit behind on time, guys. So if you, I think, I might just move ahead a little bit, and then we can come back for questions later if you have any. Does that sound okay? No objections? All right, I think we're good. Ginger family plants. So we've talked about these a little bit, but I do want to go into ginger. Zangabar officinal. So that one, it's a non-native cultigen, and that was kind of an interesting fact that I found out about it when I was researching this, is that we can't find in nature a plant that is genetically similar enough to ginger to call it a parent plant. So that typically means that ginger has been cultivated so long, and whatever plant it came from, it's genetically distinct at this point. So so we don't really know exactly where it's native to. We have a sense of where it probably came from, but it's not, we can't prove it. So that was kind of a neat thing, that it's a cultigen. And It's a subtropical and tropical perennial, but people grow it as an annual. And the reason we grow it as an annual is because the part that we harvest and eat is the rhizome. So you really have to dig up and disturb the plant in order to be able to get that spice harvest. The plant tolerance from my trials was anywhere from 35 degrees to 105 degrees. It, more than a week at 35 degrees, it'll start to show some stress, but I was surprised that it didn't really show much stress until that point, until it had many days at 35 degrees. But it will not grow at lower temperatures. In order to actually grow, it needs to be above 65 degrees, and 65 to 85 is the ideal range. Ginger also grows anywhere from part shade to full sun. Full sun puts the plant under a little bit of stress, so you need to make sure that you keep it well watered. But part shade, it kind of gets a little bit too comfortable there and isn't always as productive. So I really have kind of found that giving it mostly full sun tends to be the best answer. And it does do really well in the front window, the sort of south-facing side of my greenhouse where I have the most light coming in at all times. So it also does well there. It does like fertile, well-draining soil. It has a pH preference for 5.5 to 6.5, so your vegetable garden range. And the other really important thing is that what you start with, your ginger starting size makes a difference. When I'm starting plants for the stem, for the above ground stems, I'll use something very small like this. When I am starting plants to grow them for the rhizomes, I'll use a rhizome that's preferably about 2 ounces. So, because what you put in tends to be about what you put out. So if you put 2 ounces in, you'll get about 6 times that amount out. If you only put 1 ounce in, you're going to get about 6 times that out. But that's in the same area. That's not going to give you the same yields. So I highly recommend that you go for a 2 ounce rhizome cutting. And another thing to know about ginger is that you could harvest the baby roots, the baby ginger rhizomes at any time. They don't really start fattening until late summer into the beginning of fall. So even for baby ginger, you're going to be looking at like 5 to 7 month period of growing time, usually closer to 7 months before it's even worth your trouble to harvest. But if you want to harvest it to replant next year, you need that plant to go through its full cycle and actually go into a kind of dormancy for the winter. And that dormancy is, we call it senescence, but it's basically where the plant becomes, mature. And ginger plants, the primary reproductive method is the rhizomes. So that's when it's fully, it's able to reproduce itself when it's got these mature rhizomes. And that senescence, you really kind of, ideally, you would let the soil get cold and let the plant, recognize, okay, the conditions aren't ideal for growing, so I'm going to harden myself off for the winter, and I'm going to cure my own roots. But if you can't leave the plant in the soil for that long because because it's getting too cold and you don't want to be bringing it in and out every time it's 50 degrees, then you can also just trim off all the leaves at the top. And that shock will force it to go into hardening itself off early. So that's kind of a little trick that you can use. So a few more tips on growing ginger. Typically I start them in February or March, but I have started them in April and May outdoors, and I get about 3 times what I put in. So if I put a 2 ounce rhizome in, I'll get a 6 ounce rhizome out. So it's not the same yields, but you can start later if you're willing to have smaller yields. Optional if you want to bring them indoors and keep them growing longer when nighttime lows are consistently below 50, you can definitely do that. And then you can, they'll, in the greenhouse, when I keep the greenhouse to 55 or 60 degrees, they'll grow very slowly. Right now they're still growing. Last year they had kind of timed out toward the end of November, but I think this year, because we've had such warm conditions, that they're still going strong, and they probably won't time out for the next month or more. But yeah, you can also just grow these indoors year round. They don't mind part shade or and even full shade. They just won't be as productive. So it's definitely a plant that you can grow on your desk or window or something like that. But they do require a large pot So you'll want to be careful that you give them enough room for those rhizomes to spread. And the rhizomes, so you can see this guy, seems to want to grow that way. If you planted it this way or even this way, it will correct itself just like garlic will. So I tend to plant them flat, and then they'll get lots of little nodes coming up and all around. And then the way that they grow is those nodes will kind of stretch out, elongate. And then as we move toward winter, the rhizomes will start to grow up. So when they grow up, sometimes they'll push out of the soil. And so if you have an extra bag of, soil or compost or something to put on them, you can cover those back up, hill them like potatoes, and they'll just keep getting plumper and plumper. So that's something to think about when you're growing those rhizomes. 12 to 18 inch deep containers are ideal. I've also given you guys my mix for the leaf. I like leaf mold, aged compost, and some of our heavy clay. That's gets a good, nice mineral mix, good aeration, lots of organic matter, and they've grown really well for me in that. And for decorative purposes, you can also just put them in like a 1 gallon pot. You won't get rhizomes, but you'll get lots of stems, and you can cut those stems as an herb. So that's another option to grow them. Now, the other thing about rhizomes is the roots grow below the rhizome. So this will be growing this way, and then it'll put down roots here. This part right here, if you get that too boggy in the soil, that can rot and be subject to disease. So, and you'll have a couple inches of soil. You want to plant this about 2 inches under. So what you want to do is let this soil dry out mostly, and you want to target your watering down into the root zone below the rhizome. And that way you don't get a lot of risk for rot and for swelling of the rhizome, so that it's kind of expanding and contracting with the water and putting stress on it. So if you can target your watering lower, you'll have better results. As far as fertilizing, I mostly do compost tea that I make with vermicompost, and that's kind of like 2 pounds in a 5 gallon bucket. And then I dilute, 1 cup of compost tea to 9 cups of water. I wouldn't use 10-10-10 though, because those high nitrogen fertilizers tend to produce lots and lots of leaf growth and not so much rhizome growth. So, and that's the slide for all the sort of growing specifics. And then harvesting, you can do the baby ginger as soon as it's worthwhile. This plant that I've got in the picture here, that's the node, that's literally the node broken off, rooted. So that's without the rhizome. And you can in fact grow an entire plant from a node, but it will take forever to get a rhizome. So that's why you don't do that. You use the whole rhizome, because these nodes will draw nutrients from the rhizome to produce more of themselves and set down really good roots, and they'll get a lot bigger faster with this head start. But you can, that fresh ginger though, that's not what I would call a spice. It's not mature. Those don't store well to plant next year. So that's not what you would be using for your seeds for next year. So that you can store it in the fridge, in the crisper drawer, and use it, as a fresh product. But that storage ginger, you want to do that senescing. You want to make sure that the leaf greens start to die, or that you force senescence by cutting them and creating that hard rhizome coating, that papery cover that makes it better for storing. And then you can keep those in a cool, dark area. Eventually they'll start to put up nodes if they see any light, or if they just sort of sense that it's time to produce again. So you can store them until those come up, and then you can even keep using them. But once they start producing these, they're going to keep doing that, and so they're not such good for storage. But you can also slice and dry them and then store them even longer, or powder them. And guys, do not get rid of your skins. If you've grown this yourself and you're confident that your practices are clean and safe, you can just wash them off and then just cut those skins and dry them and grind them, and you can use that as your powdered ginger. Are there any questions on ginger?
There are a couple. There was one a lot about growing it. Do you just buy the roots at the grocery store, or do you need to order them from a producer?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I have a resource at the end that is pretty much renowned for their good seed stock. So if you can buy seed stock, that's the ideal way to go, because these seed suppliers, seed ginger suppliers, they're taking special precautions to make sure that they're not transmitting disease to you, in your garden. But since mostly we grow these in containers around here, and we're using new soil and not trying to put them in our in-ground beds that we are going to be using for lots of other things, the risk of disease transmission is pretty low. And so I do definitely sometimes start ginger from the grocery store. If it's already sprouting like this, then there's no growth retardant on it and it's ready to grow, so you won't have problems. But if it's not sprouting, if you soak it, just soak it for 24 hours and change the water about 4 times over that period. It'll expunge anything that they've done to the outer coating to slow down this process of the nodes forming. So yeah, if you can just kind of expunge that growth retardant, then you can use the store-bought ginger. But when you look for it, if it's got cuts that have healed white, I don't know how well you guys can see it, but if it's healed white, that's fine, because that's just it's like on a potato, it's just kind of healed over and protected itself. But if you see black spots on it, that's usually, a sign of some rot, and I wouldn't use those kind of, those pieces. I would find some better pieces. But yeah, I've definitely had good luck starting things from the grocery store. But if you can get seed ginger, then you can also get more cultivars that have different flavor profiles, and it's a lot more exciting than the boring stuff you get at the grocery store.
Yeah, and then there's a question about hedychium, so the more ornamental type gingers with the big flowers that smell so good. Are they worth growing as an edible?
I have never eaten them, so if anyone has any information on that, I would love to hear it. So I'm addicted to the rhizomes. I like the stems a little bit, but I like the rhizomes the most. So, but I could imagine that they're tasty since they're so aromatic. But the big flowering gingers definitely don't create big rhizomes. So the flower kind of draws away from that rhizome production. So I don't think they'll have much of an edible rhizome, but I don't know about the flowers. A lot of ginger family plants, though, are edible. All their parts are edible. So there's a good possibility. My cat's meowing in the background. I'm sorry.
Then a question about storing, like the ginger itself. Do you keep it in the refrigerator since it is cold sensitive?
You can keep it in the refrigerator, but I wouldn't. If you're going to plant it, I would shoot for more like 55 degrees, because that'll keep it in dormancy until February or March, when you do want it to start noding out. And then when I want it to node, I just put it out on my counter. So house temperatures, if you got most of us don't have basements here, but if you have a cool location in your house, like the back of a closet or something like that, that tends to be a better than the refrigerator. All right, guys, I think I'm going to move on. We can ask some more questions at the end. But I do want to mention turmeric and galangal are 2 other ginger family plants that are quite easy and similar to grow. Turmeric and galangal are actually even more forgiving than ginger. So if you can get ginger right, you can definitely get turmeric and galangal right. Turmeric, my plants get really huge. Right now they're about almost 5 feet tall, and they're about 2 feet wide, and so like a 2x2 box is what I've got them in. And that's a single, started from a single mother. So turmeric, you do want to give it some space. And the rhizomes aren't what takes up all the room the way that it does with ginger. It's actually the big leaves. They're beautiful. And what you're seeing right there in that picture is actually a turmeric finger. So a finger and a mother, the mother is a lot bigger and it'll already have little fingers growing off the sides. So if you can get a mother to start your turmeric from, you'll have much faster production. But if you can only get fingers, you can also start from that. It'll just take a little longer before you start getting your other fingers to harvest. So, but it's a really fun and easy plant to grow. just give it a lot of room. And galangal, again, it's a perennial, and as we heard earlier, you can grow it. It's hardy in Wilmington, which I think is zone 8. So it's not a stretch to grow it here. I do keep mine in the greenhouse, and I also grow it in pots in my house, but it's a lot more cold hardy than some of the other gingers. So, but start that from a large rhizome cutting. And the thing about galangal is you don't need to dig it up since it's a perennial. You just wait until it starts spreading the stems. You'll see it start to spread outward this way, and leave your main part that you see the first year. And in the second year, these side shoots that start forming when the leaves come up, you're going to harvest the rhizomes under there. Again, the rhizomes are later in the year, so you're going to be looking for them in like August, September, October, November, December. But you don't really want to be harvesting in the beginning of spring, because there's not going to be a whole lot underground to harvest. So let's see. I think, and then cardamom. We've already talked about this quite a bit, but I've given you some growing details here, similar to ginger. Definitely needs a lot more space because of that 3 to 4 feet wide, 8 to 10 feet tall. It's also a surface feeder. So the thing about cardamom is the root system doesn't seem to be as deep as some of the other ginger family plants. So that one really responds well to liquid fertilizer. And it also likes a lot of like mycorrhizal, activities. So I cover that with some, wood chips every year, and that seems to keep it pretty happy. And high humidity, especially when it's flowering, you have got to keep it humid, or when it's mature enough to flower, which is usually somewhere about 3 to 5 years after you've been growing it. If you're not maintaining that humidity, it's not going to produce any flowers, because it's going to realize that the pollen will come out sterile. So you have to have the humidity present before the flowering period, which typically I think starts in March. And hand pollination will be necessary indoors. All right, guys, so that's some pretty detailed coverage, I think, on the ginger family plants on the saffron, but I do want to give you a little bit, some teasers for other things that you can grow. Right here, this photograph, this was my greenhouse a few years ago, but back at the beginning of the presentation, and I'll roll back to that after we finish up these other slides, it's my greenhouse now. So it's kind of an addiction. Once you get going with spices, you'll find lots of other spices to grow, and it'll take over your greenhouse, it'll take over your desktop, it'll take over parts of your vegetable garden. So it is kind of an addictive gardening love. So if you fall into that category, then here's a couple things. Peppercorn, also super easy to grow as a houseplant. There you've got your mature tolerances 45 to 95. So it can take a little bit more cold than you would imagine, but you want to kind of keep it in the 65 to 85 degree range. It grows in full sun. It actually grows all the way to part shade, but to full shade. But at full shade, you won't ever get peppercorn production. So you want to aim for full sun to part shade if you actually want the peppercorns. Again, it's kind of like a vegetable garden soil, pH 6 to 7, lots of organic matter, fertile. It will take about 5 years to harvest outside of its native habitat, because it doesn't have ideal conditions no matter how hard you try, so it's going to take a while. And again, you want to think about humidity for this plant. It doesn't require as much humidity as, say, the cardamom, but it's definitely a plant that has aerial roots. It likes to be misted. It likes to trellis up things. And so the more moisture you can keep in the air around the plant, the more likely you are to actually get a harvest in that 5-year range. It is self-fertile, but you'll get more production with cross-pollination. In the greenhouse, even closed up, without, with nothing more than like a random fly that comes in, you can still get production even if nothing is pollinating it, but cross-pollination is ideal. If you can grow 2 plants, or if you can even just pollinate, the plant that you have. So, but it is really a lovely container plant. I highly recommend that if you want to try something really exotic, go for pepper. It does require trellising, and it doesn't attach itself the way that vanilla does. So you will have to kind of train it up and, you know, use your ties to hold it in place. It's also extremely easy to layer. So I've got one or two start from root cuttings. So this is a root cutting, stem cutting, I'm sorry, stem cutting. This is a stem cutting I took about 2.5 weeks ago, and it's already rooted. So it's rooted itself, and it's put on its first new leaf in 2.5 weeks. So that gives you an idea of how easy it is to propagate this stuff from cuttings or from layering. So once you have a plant, you can create another plant and start sharing with all your friends. So so keep that in mind. Don't, you know, think of it as holiday gifts and get lots of people hooked on growing peppercorn plants. And then vanilla is an orchid. I'll save questions on these 2 slides for the end because we're almost there, and then we can have the rest of the time to chit chat. But vanilla is an orchid, and I actually got these images from the North Carolina Zoo. One of their employees over there, Cody Britton, gave me a tour and an explanation, and my vanilla is still fairly young and hasn't started flowering yet. So this is one plant that I had to become an expert at, not by my own experience, but by talking to experts. So I went to the North Carolina Zoo and got all the details from Cody on his care. But it does require very high humidity during the flowering period. They're keeping their plant at about 60% all the time, and that works very well. It's super easy to propagate by cuttings. If you can get a 12-inch cutting, that's ideal, because a plant that's already got 12 inches has a good start. They're going to set, it'll root just as fast as the black pepper will. And this is one plant, though, that you really don't want to drop below 50 degrees because the leaves will, they start to look glassy and they'll just kind of wilt and die. So keep it above 50, but ideally 70 to 85 is the target. I wouldn't give it direct sunlight, but bright light. I've got it growing in the greenhouse, and it loves being in the greenhouse because it's already a reduced sun environment. I've also got some growing on my desktop, and I actually trellis it over my window. So it goes right along the window and up and over it on the south side of my house. And just that peripheral light coming through, you know, the leaves will reach into the light when they need it. That seems to work really well. It will take you a minimum of 3 years to harvest, and probably longer in less than perfect conditions. So be ready to wait. And also orchid potting mix. This is not a soil growing plant, but it does like a little bit more organic matter than a lot of your epiphytes. So if you want to mix in just a little bit of compost with your orchid mix, it'll like that. And definitely trellis upward. The thing about vanilla is it's going to need to grow up at least 3 feet and then come back down before it will flower, and it will flower primarily on the downhill side. And so what a lot of people will do is grow it as a zigzag so that you're going up and down, and that way you can kind of keep it in a more compact space. So, so you can get original with your trellising. It doesn't need to grow 20 feet up, but if you want good production, it will need some space to zigzag. And the really important thing with vanilla is pollination. When it does flower, the flower pollen is only viable for a couple of hours in the morning when the flower opens, and pollination is a little bit tricky. There are lots of videos on YouTube, so rather than me describing this, just look up vanilla pollination videos on YouTube, and you'll see people, they take a toothpick and you kind of, I always describe it as like folding the top of an envelope under the bottom of an envelope. You literally kind of have to expose the pollen and then and kind of fold it into an envelope. But there are really good videos for this online. And actually next week I'll be putting one up on my website, so you can always check back there. So the hand pollination every day for about 2 months, if you want to get good production, is the only complication with growing vanilla. Otherwise, it's an easy to grow orchid that just requires trellises. And then the next part is when you're harvesting vanilla, you want to get it before it's fully mature. It'll actually split at the end when it's starting to dry, and you want to get it before it splits at the end. It'll turn brown, but don't let it start to turn like yellow and crack at the ends. And you have to ferment it internally. And that basically means you want to sweat it. So you kind of wrap it in like a big heavy towel or a heavy blanket, and you cause it to get hotter inside, and that will ferment the inside of the vanilla bean. But you don't want it to mold, so you have to air it out. You have to unfold the blanket at least once a day, let it get some air, typically a little bit of sun to warm it back up a little bit, and then you wrap it back up in the blanket. So it's not very difficult. It's weird. We haven't done internal fermentation, typically in our gardens before. So it's just a little bit weird to get it to get our heads around that process, but it's not difficult at all. And the last one I want to mention for you is Sichuan or Sichuan pepper. These are just anglicized versions of Chinese characters, so they're both correct terms. You can find it under both names, but there's the scientific name. This is actually just like a citrus family plant. It's cold hardy, like the trifoliate oranges that we can grow here pretty easily. You can propagate by cuttings or by seeds. Typically cuttings are better though for good production, because or getting an already established plant, just because then you're cloning and you know what you're getting. It is a very prickly plant. I'm showing you the spikes right there. It's a lot like the black locust or in those spikiness, but in appearance, it's a little bit more like an elderberry. So it can be a multi-stemmed shrub kind of plant. It'll grow part shade to full sun, but you'll get the best production in full sun. It does like moist and well-draining soil. Pretty much I think of it like, if you can, any soil you make for your vegetable garden will work great for this Sichuan pepper. The flowering period is May to June, and the fruit ripens a couple months later. But the whole plant is fragrant. And you do have to be careful though when you're getting your plants, because some of them are self-fertile. It's kind of like allspice. Some are self-fertile, and some you need male and female plants. So make sure you know which one you're buying. If you can get the self-fertile one, that's of course ideal, because then you don't have to have multiple plants. But you can grow it in the ground here. It's cold hardy for all of our locations in North Carolina. It can also take the heat in all of our locations, or you can put it in a large pot. So I don't have a whole lot of experience with this plant yet. I've actually only had mine in the ground for a year, but it's really happy and low maintenance, and it does smell really nice. So if you've got an edible landscape, it's a wonderful choice. So I'm going kind of quick because I just want to leave us a few minutes to chit chat at the end. Problems for spices. Thankfully, a lot of these exotics don't have problems, because nobody is growing large fields of them. So we're not attracting the favorite pests. So really the main things are, just that sort of good hygiene. Make sure you're getting the disease-free plants. And then, when you bring a new plant in from an outside source, just keep a close eye on it, monitor it, keep an eye, make sure that none of our native pests are starting to get to it. Same indoor problems you suffer, with all your other plants. It's definitely, a lot of these plants can get sooty mold, and a lot of them will, have problems with scale. It's just because of the moisture, those situations invite that. So you will have to keep an eye out for those things. Outdoor, the main things are, all the regular pests. I'm showing those harlequin bugs here. They're on my horseradish plants. A lot of these outdoor spice plants are pretty durable though, and a little pest problem won't usually take them out. But the drainage issues, like we were talking about with the saffron corn problem that might be occurring, you definitely need to plan for good drainage and deal with our fungal pathogens. So, and those are kind of, fungal pathogens are our biggest thing here, I think, in North Carolina. So that applies for sure to any of these plants. So lots of airflow, give them room so that they can breathe and stay, stay on the drier side. Last thing I promised you guys was that resources list. So I've worked with all of these companies, so I feel comfortable putting them on this list here. I think that, but there aren't a whole lot of resources for spices. You can definitely check on Etsy too. There have been more plant specialists showing up on Etsy. That's where I found that companionplants.com. But these are the places I've had good luck. So I just wanted to share that, since I know spices are so hard to find. And This is all going to be recorded, as Charlotte mentioned earlier. And so, so you'll be able to come back and get this. But if you guys want to take a screen capture of it right now, please just go ahead and do that before I roll to the last slides. Charlotte, while we give everyone a minute on this, are there any questions?
Yes, there have been some. So of course the sources was a big recurring question. So thank you so much for sharing that information. We did have a question about, do you know if any of these plants that have been mentioned, specifically ones you could grow as houseplants, are poisonous to pets? And I did put a couple of references in the chat on just general plants that are poisonous to pets, but is anything you've mentioned specifically an issue?
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't actually think so, because most of these have edible leaves. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but everything that I've been growing, my pets have not been interested in. So even the gingers, I was surprised. I thought, and those would be safe for pets because they're typically fully edible. But yeah, I haven't come across anything in particular, but that is a good question. So I'll do some research, and if I find anything, I'll report back.
Great. Kind of a similar related question is, how about the herbs, particularly at the beginning when you had the slide and you were talking about different herbs and spices you could grow outdoors, chicken friendly. What could you feed your chickens, or anything maybe you shouldn't feed your chickens?
Okay, well, I always feed my chickens anything and let them decide. So I always find them very smart. But let me roll back to that slide. I'm sorry. Just to take a quick look here. So yeah, I would say, I mean, I don't grow my peppers near my chickens, but they'll eat those too if I, throw them out in my compost pile or something. Yeah, I don't really see anything on there on the list that would be. Angelica, like I said, there could be some minor toxicity there. I don't know anything particular to chickens, but you might want to just skip growing that one right next to them. But my chickens definitely love the mustard, because I always, after I finish threshing my mustard, I throw them, the leftover bits, which always still have some seeds in it, and they go crazy for it. So I know they love that. But yeah, I don't think any of these would be toxic to chickens. Saffron is only the stigmas are edible, really. So that one you might not want to let your chickens run through your saffron patch, because I don't know any for sure whether there's any toxicity there. But let's head back down here and cover these last two slides just for everybody. I think they were just, oh, yes. So shameless book plug here, guys. This is what the cover looks like. It's also got some herbal medicinal tips in there from Lindsay Feldpouch. I always say her last name wrong, but she used to be at the Eclectic School of Herbal Medicine that was here in Low Gap where I live. Now she's up near Floyd, but she's still got a strong attachment to that school. So another local person was involved in this project. So I just wanted to give a shout out to her. And also for people who love gardening books and love like illustrations, Greta Moore, who did the illustrations, I mean, she's phenomenal with her color. You can see her illustrations there on the cover. So she's got a few more inside the book. And it was just really nice to have such a plant-loving illustrator doing some of the work for this book. But my last slide is kind of pretty, so I want to share that. It's my question slide. And so part of the book is, teaching people about gardening, not just about spices. And so you can see up in the corner, I've got a straight chicory, and then I've got this multi-branched forked chicory that I kind of did as a fun experiment, just to show people what happens if you don't grow things in appropriately deep, fertile soil all the way through, that you can get these branching, forking, fun things like our carrots when they go crazy. But okay, guys, so the rest of this time is really devoted to questions. And I think we were originally scheduled to stay until 12, but I'm happy if Charlotte has the time to stay on a little bit longer since I talked too much.
Yeah, sure. And so I was going to ask, with your book, do you include information about processing and using some of the spices and
Yeah.
herbs?
Yeah, I have harvesting
Yeah.
and preserving instructions for everything. And I've also got sort of a general overview of how to do it. And Charlotte, you mentioned that my book was out. It was technically supposed to be out on December 8th, but the container that the books were coming in got damaged in transit. So now the shipment date is January 5th. So you can order online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can also go to Quarto Knows and look up the book there. That's the publisher. So it's available to order, but unfortunately the physical book won't be in people's hands before January 5th. So that was my, I've been waiting so long. I haven't even seen this thing yet. Just
It'll be a worthwhile wait.
Yeah.
We did have a couple of questions from earlier about some of the specific herbs. I can go ahead and share. From Marcia asked about saffron, especially when you were talking about digging it up and dividing it. Do you replant immediately, or do you hold them?
You can store it just
in the
like you
fall?
would any other bulb if you wanted to, and replant in, in like August. But you can also directly plant. So if you're having an issue with your corms being, if your bulbs are getting flooded and you're losing them to some of the weird rainy conditions that we've been having lately, then you might want to go ahead and dig them up as soon as, in May when the greens die back, and just go ahead and store them and save them and put them back in the ground in August. So that way you reduce your risk a little bit. So it really, when I dig them up, I usually just replant them so I don't have to think about storing them and, keep them like you would your dahlias or something. But I live in a small house, so I just try not to store if I don't have to. I try to keep everything in the ground, but you can go either way.
Okay. Some folks were curious about the size of your greenhouse to grow all these plants.
Yeah, so I have a 12 by 36 foot greenhouse. I do lots of plant experiments up there. I'm kind of like, I'm a homesteader and a writer, so I work at home and I can never sit. This is the longest I ever sit, this 2-hour conversation, because I'm usually up every hour or so, running out to look at something in the garden or running up to the greenhouse because I'm not a sitter. But I have, besides the greenhouse, I also have an indoor garden in my house. My office is like half covered with plants. And I have a 4,000 square foot vegetable garden, and I have 3 other 2,000 square foot gardens that I use for, a lot of different, one year it might be flowers, one year it might be spices. I just kind of rotate and try different things. So I garden in a pretty large area, and that's why I do a lot of experimenting, because I'm not trying to get massive production. I'm really trying to understand plants and see what they're capable of, see what they really need. I'm not a myth buster, because that's, it's easy to tell someone they're wrong. It's hard to figure out what's right. But I do like to understand, whether the things that we keep reading, are in fact true in a real life garden scenario. So whenever I read something and I'm like, oh, really? Beans can't grow with garlic? Let me try that. And so I'm like, no, my beans grow absolutely fabulous with garlic. So I've stopped saying that those aren't good companions, because I found it to be completely untrue in my own garden. But if I had the small space, then I would just listen to what other people said, and I would not risk my garlic over some beans.
Let's see. We had a couple of questions about turmeric and the plants not flowering. And what would prevent them from flowering?
Okay, turmeric and ginger really don't flower unless they're put under stress, because flowering isn't their primary reproductive method. So I'm talking about there's lots of ginger family plants that do flower and don't produce large rhizomes. So those should flower as long as you're giving them the right humidity and light and soil and moisture conditions. But the ones that we have actually cultivated for spices, they won't flower very often. Like I have 4 feet by 12 feet devoted to ginger in my greenhouse, and I've had 2 flowers in 3 years. So the flowering isn't a primary reproductive tool for that plant, the rhizomes are. So if they're flowering, it usually means that something's kind of gone wrong in the production. And turmeric, I've never seen it flower. So I think that maybe the expectation should be that they're not going to flower. Does that make sense?
And yes, that's a good thing they're not flowering. And we've had a couple of requests actually to go and look at your first slide again and all the plants in your greenhouse and tell us what they are.
Yes, thank you guys for reminding me. I said I was going to go back to that. Let's roll back here. Okay, there it was. That one. Yes, so you can see the on the right, I've got, starting from the far right, there's some allspice. Then there is some ginger in the very background there. There's turmeric. I have an olive tree, an Arbequina olive tree. When you cross over into the center, the taller sort of like thin-leafed thing is a tamarind. Down below it is one of my young cardamom plants. And I've also got some patchouli that you can kind of see in there. There's little heart-shaped leaves up on the far left side. That's the annatto. And behind all of that, there is a lemon tree, the Meyer lemon tree that I was talking about before we started. Forgot who we were talking to, but someone else had a Meyer lemon tree in their garden. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. But yes, and so there are also plants hiding behind there. You can't see it in this picture, but I've got a vanilla growing before the Arbequina olive, but behind all the stuff you see there. I've got lemongrass in there. I've got galangal growing behind that tamarind. I've got black pepper behind the tamarind and the annatto, and bay leaf as well. Bay leaf actually takes a huge amount of shade. And so I've been growing it in both full sun and full shade just for fun. And then you can't see it, but I have coffee plants. I've got tea plants. Gosh, I've got kaffir lime. I've got 2 kinds of oranges. I have a key lime tree and 2 kinds of avocado and 2 kinds of curry leaf trees. And I've got ashitaba, which is a Japanese superfood kind of herb that's supposed to promote longevity, but it doesn't taste very good. So my greenhouse is pretty packed.
Excellent. There's a question about if you've had success with avocado.
So avocados are pretty new for me. My plants are going on 2 years, and I bought them as 2-year plants. So I'm not really expecting a harvest till next year, but I can't imagine that they wouldn't work out because the growing conditions inside the greenhouse are pretty ideal. So I can't swear, but I have a good feeling.
And we definitely have lots of compliments, coming in the chat. People really enjoyed it and really appreciate it, and definitely appreciate you taking the time and sharing all your knowledge with us.
Yes.
I think we've hit most of the questions from the chat. The question about if your greenhouse is heated, I expect it is.
Oh, yes. So I do heat my greenhouse. I usually start at the end of October. I've got an electric heater because we live on mostly solar panels. I am tied into the grid, but we try to provide all of our electricity on solar panels. So I have an electric heater. It's actually for 120 square foot space, but I also have a hot tub in the very far back corner, a wood-fired hot tub in my greenhouse, and that provides some heat too. I have a water fountain. That's like my escape place. I don't travel, so I just go up to my greenhouse. So I have some luxury items in there that help keep it warm.
Do you need to put shade cloth on in the summer to keep it to moderate it in the summer?
I actually don't, because of the way that I plan my taller plants to shade my more sensitive plants. And the reason I've got that Meyer lemon and that Arbequina olive in there is because they do provide a little bit of, they're like shade cover for the plants that are more sensitive. Otherwise, I've got my greenhouse oriented so that our sort of northwestern winds come straight down through the door alley there. And so I just open the doors. I barely ever open my windows, but just by having that many plants in there, and running a water fountain. It kind of controls the humidity, and then having those two big plants at the center, the Arbequina olive and the Meyer lemon. I've created a lot of just natural climate control. It's kind of like a jungle in there. And I have soil and mulch down as my floor. So soil, as I think we all know, is a really moderating influence on temperatures. So it kind of provides a nice cooling blanket as long as I keep everything well watered. I even water the mulched paths so that they keep the temperature down in the greenhouse.
Very good. I think we've hit most of the questions from the chat.
Yeah.
I don't know how long you're, interested to hang out, because I know you have another presentation this afternoon.
Yep, teaching a compost class. But
yeah.
No, I really want to thank everyone for coming and listening. And I love sharing about spices. Obviously, there's a lot of information in this presentation. So when Charlotte gets that up, you might want to watch it again, because I know I have a bad habit of sharing way too much information. I just want to give it all to you so then you can take it and do something with it.
Well, it is all greatly appreciated, and we should have this posted hopefully by end of the day tomorrow, if not in very early next week. And we'll send that link out directly to the email list if you're on the NCEMGV email list, and of course it'll be posted on our YouTube channel. So I love from Gail says, thank you for a spicy talk. And I just want to echo that and just say how much I appreciate you taking time to share your knowledge and then your passion as well for growing.
Thank you.
For growing spices. So we really appreciate it.
It's fun to be with other master gardeners and just be able to talk plants. Next time someone else will have to talk though. Need to hear from some of you guys.
Yeah, we did have people actually sharing quite a lot of interesting tips in the chat. So that was great to see folks growing different things and sharing what they know.
Great plants, and yes, thank you for the awapuhi. I'm going to get that right going forward.
Yeah, and Joanna's added a link to your composting talk this afternoon in the chat. So you guys, if you want to tune back in for composting, click that link and copy it for your. Oh, and we usually do get a couple questions about saving the chat. You can do that if you go into the bottom of the chat box where you'd enter a message. You see on the right side the little circle with the dot, and if you click on that, it's one of the options. The first option should be save chat. And so if you do want to save the chat, that's how you can do it. All right. And the question about the composting webinar being recorded, are y'all going to record that there? Yeah.
It will be recorded.
Okay.
Oh, but Joanna, because I think when you send out the link, it's not public, so they still should probably register so that they can get the recording later. Is that right?
Yes, as long as you register and I have your email address, we can send that to you. And it usually goes out. We have these on Thursday and they'll go out on Monday, the recordings.
Very good. All right. So thank you all. And also, thank you to Joanna as well she's helped get this set up and help get me and Tasha connected to get this going. So really appreciate it. So I think we'll go ahead and close things out so Tasha and Joanna can get ready for their 2 o'clock talk on composting. And we appreciate everybody joining us today. And like we said, we'll be sending out the recording so you can listen again and review and take notes on anything you missed.
Thank you.
Hope everybody has wonderful, wonderful holidays if we don't see you or talk before then, and stay healthy.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Charlotte, I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know why, but I could not get the chat to come up. I'm so sorry, but thank you for jumping in on that. It's as soon as I close stop the share, then the chat's up there. So, and I did the